Now look, I know I said I won't talk about this show on a weekly basis, and I won't, that's still the plan, but I'll gladly make an exception for this episode. I wasn't planning on making this video, but after watching the thing, I had to. Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2 Episode 5 was easily the best directed episode to come out of this series so far. It was also one of the best looking episodes across both the seasons, despite the fact that this episode had no action. As you might know, Jujutsu Kaisen is an action-oriented show and most of its resources are allocated to that department. Despite that, this non-action episode looked phenomenal. It's probably the boldest and the most unique episode this series has to offer. Let's break down the visuals and the direction. Make sure to subscribe. This episode was directed by Atsushi Nakagawa, with Sota Yamazaki and Takuya Ninuma serving as assistant episode directors. Series director Shota Goshizono was in charge of the storyboards, and Takuya Ninuma was an animation director for this episode. And to me, Goshizono and Ninuma were the stars of this episode. I'm not too familiar with Nakagawa's works. As I mentioned, this episode was bold. It wasn't afraid of angering a certain portion of the fan base that hates creativity. It was an episode that utilized its visual medium to the fullest. I feel like this episode will receive a lot of hate because you know the drill. Anything creative and or different is bad. Let's clarify a few things here. None of the characters in this episode were CGI, and none of the scenes were rotoscoped. At least none that we know of. The very first cut we see has a fisheye effect added to it because of course it does. If you're new, series director Shota Goshizono loves using those. Takuya Ninuma was the animation director around this part. Ninuma is an incredible animator. He specializes in character acting animation and he's one of the most promising talents out there. His artwork isn't necessarily detail heavy, but he has a distinct way of drawing character outlines and shadows, often allowing for a three-dimensional look, which of course complements Goshizono's overall vision. Ninuma's corrections were all over the first half of this episode, and they did an incredible job of making the already appealing designs fun to look at. His work was a crucial aspect of this episode's visual quality. While we had plenty of character acting, this episode did have some static moments, and Ninuma's corrections added the perfect amount of visual flavor to these scenes, making them interesting despite a lack of movement. Although I'm not the biggest fan of this cut, Gojo's head proportions look weird to me. It's oddly squished. As for the actual animation, this cut looked absolutely phenomenal. Now, I don't throw the word rotoscope around, but I genuinely thought this cut might be rotoscoped for a second. Of course, the hand animation is insanely smooth, but that's not all. The movement is incredibly realistic. The subtle thumb movements, the way each finger moves often independent of the rest, it's insane. Also, the smeared pencil looks really good. This entire sequence ties into the opening scene from episode 1. I like stuff like that. The storyboards throughout this episode looked really creative, which isn't exactly a surprise. Goshizono has mastered the art of storyboarding incredibly creative scenes that require very little animation. Geto is essentially a still frame here. The strap hangers are the only animated things here. Also, this scene treads the uncanny valley perfectly. These stills have a heavy amount of motion blur, which is ironic because these are stills. They aren't actually moving, there's no real motion here. But the blurring adds to that uncanny vibe. Ninuma's art is so well used here. These humans look eerily realistic, almost like real people but not quite. And this is just my interpretation, but I think this is supposed to represent Geto's state of mind. A part of him thinks non-sorcerers are below him. From his point of view, they aren't humans, but at the same time, a part of him knows that they are people who need to be protected. Thus the almost human but not quite look. Also, these religious people, that doesn't sound right. These cultists have the same look to them. Geto in the shower is another example of Goshizono managing to storyboard a scene with practically no movement, but somehow making it interesting to look at. Besides some liquid effects, this entire sequence consists of a bunch of still frames, but this is one of the best looking scenes in the entire episode. This one shot in particular looks fantastic. The face is incredibly well drawn, obviously. Ninuma's correction work is amazing here. The volumetric shadows and the outlines are flawless. But that's not all. The face has a complex perspective. It's not a front profile, it has a downward tilt. But that's not all. The body has a complex perspective with respect to the face, with a minor amount of foreshortening involved. But that's not all. The body itself has a slight tilt with one shoulder being closer to the screen. It's It's a single frame with some liquid movement, but it's insanely complicated. As someone who tries to animate, I can only imagine the amount of skill required to draw a scene like this. Goshozono's storyboard is very complex and three-dimensional, and it is executed perfectly. Of course, I can't talk about every single frame, not because there isn't enough material, but because there's only so much time. Plenty of character acting can be seen throughout this episode, and the Ninuma corrections look fantastic. This episode had a serious presentation all around, but it did have its goofy moments. This cut, for example, even the background is stylized here. Also, this incredibly loose art style. I'm not the biggest fan of this approach, but I don't have a problem with it either. We get another fisheye shot because of course. Also, I prefer these clever ways of integrating flashbacks into the ongoing scene, as opposed to the hard cut to a previous episode with a filter thrown in approach. I can't get over how good the character art is. The amount of polish this episode had was incredible, especially for a temporally struggling production like Jujutsu Kaisen. A first-person shot here, and obviously that wasn't complicated enough, so they added the cigarette into the frame as well. Love the perspective on the face. The tilt is perfectly communicated thanks to Ninuma's outlines. The storyboards were particularly creative around this scene. The wooden beams hide their eyes, dehumanizing them, almost as if you're looking at them the same way Geto is. This scene with the fire is animated by Hisashi Mori, the literal definition of an industry veteran. The line art looks very different here. It's thicker and has a raw, uneven look, which makes the scene stand out in the best possible way. Also, the effects are amazing despite the ghosting. This scene was corrected by Sota Yamazaki, and it looked phenomenal. The drawings were really strong, and the general expressiveness of Gojo's facial expressions and body language was particularly impressive. And speaking of impressive, the entire crowd throughout this sequence was 2D, and I don't think you understand how insane that is. Every single person in this crowd had to be hand animated. Mappa is a studio with an amazing CGI department. The crowd here could have easily been 3D, but it was not. Again, ridiculously impressive. Also, the character acting on Gojo is phenomenal here. He is so expressive. Also, I like the transitions using the vehicles. Notice how the vehicles that serve as the transition to Gojo and the ones that serve as the transition to Geto move in opposite directions. Very clever. I can't get over the crowd. It's nearly 2 minutes worth of hand animated crowd animation. Of course, not every cut is animated. Some of the scenes involve stills being dragged across the screen, but it's done well and you barely notice. Some solid character acting brings us to the highlight of this episode in terms of animation. Presumably animated by Takuya Ninuma, this is one of the most impressive cuts of character acting in recent memory. Every bit of movement looks realistic, but not in an unnatural way. It looks real all while retaining its anime look. The drawings are so unique and charming to look at. The fingers often melt together, of course intentionally so. The drawings aren't too detailed here, but the smooth shadows, especially those on the outfit, look amazing. The liquid animation looks really good here. Also, the eye literally has no outlines. Another unique look. Even the microphone looks incredible and moves really well. I think the microphone also lacks outlines, but it's hard to tell because of the motion blur. Again, the lack of outlines is a stylistic choice. A decent bit of background animation here. I've said this before, the amount of background animation this season is ridiculous. The character art here is almost devoid of any detail and line work, but the competent drawings, interesting storyboards, and the compositing makes the scene aesthetically pleasing. We then get our first look at the main trio, and the simple designs are here to stay. The show won't revert back to the original designs for the Shibuya arc, which is perfectly fine by me. And that brings us to the end of this episode, and to the end of this arc. And what a treat this episode was. Again, it will receive a lot of hate because creativity bad and all that, but I think it looked spectacular. That's about it. Did you like this video? Check out this other bit of content on screen. Yes, I do re-record this part every time. Make sure to subscribe, and until next time.